If you've ever read first-hand accounts from soldiers stationed along the North Sea during World War II, one detail keeps surfacing in letters and unit diaries. The wind never stopped. Rain drove sideways. Canvas tents shredded themselves in days. Men froze, not because they lacked courage or discipline, but because their shelter failed them. What saved thousands of troops from exposure wasn't better tents or thicker blankets. It was a field shelter system that most people today barely know existed, yet it quietly outperformed everything else thrown at it. This isn't romantic survival folklore. This was engineered, tested, and proven under some of the harshest weather conditions Europe could deliver. What makes this worth your attention today is not nostalgia. It's the fact that the same principles behind this World War II setup still outperform modern ultralight camping systems in cold, wet, high-wind environments. If you care about historical accuracy, fieldcraft, or real-world survival beyond marketing hype, this setup deserves serious study. Why World War II forces abandoned tents faster than history books admit. Early in the war, Allied forces relied heavily on standard canvas bell tents and ridge tents, assuming mobility mattered more than durability. North Sea deployments shattered that assumption within weeks. Canvas absorbed moisture, doubled in weight, sagged under rain, and collapsed when frozen. More importantly, tents trapped condensation. Soldiers slept wet even when it wasn't raining. Hypothermia cases skyrocketed, especially among coastal units and anti-aircraft crews who couldn't relocate easily. By late 1941, British and Canadian units began quietly shifting away from tents altogether for semi-static positions. The Germans had already learned this lesson during earlier North Atlantic deployments. The answer wasn't a new tent design. It was a low-profile, earth-integrated shelter that worked with the environment instead of fighting it. The WWII stormproof setup relied on earth, timber, and geometry. The core of the system was the sunken bivouac hut, often called a dug-in shelter or half-buried field hut. Instead of sitting above ground like a sail, waiting for wind, the shelter floor was dug 2 to 4 feet into the earth. This instantly stabilized temperature, blocked wind at ground level, and eliminated lateral rain intrusion. Earth isn't just cover, it's insulation. Even shallow ground maintains a far more stable temperature than open air. The roof mattered just as much. Rather than canvas, troops used timber poles, scavenged locally, laid at a shallow pitch barely above ground level. On top of this went layers of brush, turf, and finally soil. The result wasn't pretty, but it was nearly invisible from a distance and shrugged off gale-force winds. Snow accumulated harmlessly instead of collapsing the structure, adding insulation rather than danger. Why this shelter survived North Sea storms when modern tents fail? Wind is the real killer in cold environments, not temperature alone. This WWII setup eliminated wind exposure almost entirely. With the entrance facing away from prevailing winds and often shielded by a short trench or blast wall, airflow inside dropped to near zero. Modern tents, no matter how advanced, still rely on fabric tension and poles. They flex, flap, and eventually fail. Earth does not flap. Moisture control was another overlooked advantage. You know, condensation is pretty much unavoidable, but earthen walls absorb moisture slowly and release it gradually, unlike synthetic fabrics that just drip water directly onto sleepers. Soldiers often lined sleeping areas with wooden duckboards or straw, keeping bodies off the damp ground. Even when soaked externally, the interior environment remained survivable. Heating, light and smoke were solved with, well, brutal simplicity. One reason people assume dug-in shelters were unlivable is fire risk. In reality, WWII units developed simple but effective solutions. Small, low-smoke stoves made from ammo tins or fuel cans were vented through angled flues made of scavenged pipe or even stacked tins. Smoke cooled before exiting, reducing visibility and fire risk. Heat collected near the roof and radiated back down through the earthen mass. Lighting came from shielded candles or oil lamps placed in recessed niches cut into the wall. This prevented accidental contact and minimized fire hazards. These weren't comfortable spaces by peacetime standards, but they were warm, dry and stable in conditions that shredded tents in just a few hours. Now, let's talk about how this World War II knowledge fits right into modern survival and prepping. If you're planning cold weather camps, emergency shelters, or even semi-permanent retreat structures, the lesson is, well, pretty clear. Stop thinking in terms of portable shelters alone. Really, you need to start thinking in terms of integrated shelter. Even today, a shallow dug-in shelter with a properly pitched debris roof will outperform a four-season tent in sustained wind and freezing rain. A modern application, you know, could involve digging into a slope rather than flat ground, using pressure-treated lumber or logs for framing and sealing the roof with modern vapour barriers beneath soil layers. Ventilation must be deliberate, not accidental. A simple vertical vent with a hood prevents smoke build-up while maintaining heat retention. For short-term use, even partially digging your tent floor below grade and banking soil or snow around the sides dramatically improves performance. World War II field manuals explicitly recommended this, yet it's rarely discussed in modern outdoor circles. Why should historians and survivalists take this setup seriously? Well, this shelter system wasn't just theoretical. It was documented, refined and standardized because, quite frankly, lives depended on it. Units that adopted it saw fewer cold weather casualties and, higher combat readiness. And it actually influenced post-war military engineering, from Cold War observation posts all the way to modern fighting positions. Understanding it properly, I think, requires rejecting the idea that progress always means lighter or newer. Sometimes progress means rediscovering what worked when failure simply wasn't an option. The North Sea didn't care about morale or doctrine. It rewarded physics, earth, and, well, experience. The lasting lesson WWII shelters teach us is really quite profound. The real takeaway isn't how to recreate a 1940s dugout exactly. It's about learning why it worked and applying those principles intelligently today. Wind control, thermal mass, low profile, and moisture management. They matter far more than brand names or gear lists. WWII soldiers learned this the hard way, and they left behind a blueprint that, honestly, still outperforms many modern solutions. If you value history that teaches real-world skills, not just dates and uniforms, this is knowledge worth preserving and practicing. And if you found this breakdown valuable, do subscribe to The Prepper Historian, share this with fellow historians and survivalists, and, keep this knowledge alive where it belongs.